Okay, now that I've finished a Jungian understanding of Plato's dialogues, the next step I want to take is to argue for patterns in Plato's dialogues. And I think the dialogues are full of patterns, and the patterns go from one dialogue to the next. So Plato says that the dialectician sees the whole and the parts in relationship to the whole. So I do think he wants you to read his dialogues as together giving an image of all the questions in life, the universe as such, and our place in it. And the wise person grasps all of these things as a microcosm in the macrocosm, and the dialogues all fit together to form a complete worldview. And this view includes every mistake possible. It includes the entire range of good and evil. It's not just a vision of the good, it's a realistic image of all the ways people go wrong, all the things they do to undermine, to turn away from the good, and the reasons they give, and the type of characters that get manipulated by those who are overtly wicked, that and what ignorance. Anyway, I mean every variety. Plato has a theory of everything, and it all fits together as parts in a whole. Um, then Plato is trying to educate according to the patterns in Greek paideia that he grew up with. So he incorporates those patterns, and then he creates his own kind of literary genre, and he goes beyond. I think he thinks every generation has a responsibility to try and take the culture to a higher level. So I don't think he's rebelling against his forefathers. He's trying to create something more sophisticated. He does point out that his elders, his authority figures, are corrupt, as I've said many times, and they don't understand what the point of all Athens civilization was about, and they have this false notion that a free and flourishing society is just about freedom to do whatever you like, when actually the way it was structured was to gain wisdom. Um, I'll I've done a lot of work on the dialogues that were set in during what I call before the fall of Athens, when Athens was powerful and proud of itself, and the Athenians were really full of themselves before they lost the war and Critias took over, and the reign of terror, and the return of the democracy, and then the death of Socrates. I have done work on the Apology, the Euthyphro, the Crito, and the Phaedo, and I'll talk about that. But there are a number of dialogues set before the fall, and it shows the ignorance of the people about what's coming. They couldn't possibly believe that they could lose their wonderful free society. So that's the plot. So what I want to say is that an important part of the plot is what's coming. And I think Plato expected people to know this. He gives very specific descriptions of the empirical setting so that you can figure out when this conversation took place. And then all you need to know are some bare bones about the lives of the people in the dialogue. You can learn a lot without knowing the historical context, but the thing that's interesting is that when Socrates questions these people and they come up with a false opinion, the very weakness of their opinion is the weakness of their character. And eventually, that character weakness and that false opinion is what causes them to come to a bad end. It's a mistake in judgment, and it leads to personal suffering and then the suffering of their city. So, first, I want to summarize the criteria for tragedy once more, just to point out that I think Plato's dialogues follow those patterns, but they go beyond those patterns. Um, so, according to Walter Kaufman, there are 5 sort of basic criteria of tragedy, and I've written about this. Um, but one, but I think Plato incorporates 4 of them, and is very much against the last one, and so are the tragedians. So the first one is humankind's radical insecurity, that the people in these Paideia documents, and I want to emphasize that it's not just Plato's dialogues. I'm not going to separate him at this point. I'll explain what I think is different, where he went beyond his tradition, but for right now, all of them expose the radical insecurity of human life, and people are unaware of what's going to happen. Oedipus is a nice example of the radical difference between the world of appearances and the world of reality, and he's going to come to a bad end pretty quickly. So, so people are vulnerable, and that's why they have a lot to fear, and that's why they often overreact out of fear and a sense of vulnerability. So tragedy tries to educate them by showing them, yes, this is real. And that's why you have to give up irrational goals and love wisdom. It's the only way to gain any level of security in a context where we are radically insecure. The second criteria is human blindness. People are blind to the fact that they're of the insecurity. They think they're more knowledgeable than they are. They think they're more powerful than they are. They think they're more secure than they are, and they're in for a big surprise. The curse of honesty. The person who's honest gets demonized, which is obviously what happened to Socrates. The other sophists flattered the Athenians and took advantage of their system and were totally in favor of their system. And Aristophanes used free speech to say all sorts of stuff. And Socrates was the only one who used his free speech to criticize the Athenians and tell them they're hypocrites, they're corrupt, they don't have any idea, they've completely lost sight of the soul of their city, of the vision of their forefathers. They say they're patriotic, and yet they have completely corrupted the the goal of wisdom their society was structured around. And of course, he's the one they kill. As long as people use their free speech to flatter or to make vulgar jokes or any sort of thing, that's fine. But as soon as you use it to try and get people to live more examined lives, and to try and let them know that they're going to fall apart unless they develop some discipline and cultivate their souls, that's the one you want to kill. Mistaken notions about justice and injustice, and this is obvious. People thought Socrates was unpatriotic, that he was an atheist and corrupted the youth, and that he deserved the hemlock, and obviously that's a poor judgment. But Plato's dialogues aren't the only place where people make those mistakes. It happens in Homer, in tragedy. If you remember, in the Agamemnon, for example, everybody calls upon Zeus to justify their behavior. So they have a mistaken notion of justice and injustice. Okay, so tragedies So that's the worldview, and that's Plato's dialogues, particularly the ones set before the fall of Athens, very much fit that. They're based on that worldview. Well, then the one thing Kaufman says that I disagree with is the inevitability of tragedy. And I think Plato is making a distinction, and I think the tragedians and Homer are making an important distinction. There's one distinction, in one sense, we are vulnerable by nature, and there's certain kinds of suffering that are going to happen. We're going to get frustrated. We're going to be surprised. Unexpected things will happen. But the tragedian, the tragedian's goal is to educate people so that they avoid unnecessary suffering, excess suffering, so they avoid those kind of mistakes in judgment that lead to personal, social, political destruction that were not necessary. The fall of Athens was not necessary. Um, so that's the difference. So what's inevitable? Um, it's inevitable that we're born ignorant and we have to learn, but it's not inevitable that people will always choose pleasure or power and drive their societies into the ground. It's not a pessimistic view. It's very optimistic. That's very important to get, is that the tragedians believed they could educate people. People do not have to make the same mistakes. They can learn, they can avoid it. And that's a great hopeful view. That's what motivates them. The tragedians is a very hopeful and optimistic view that people can be educated and you can move forward. You can avoid a lot of suffering, even in the context of ignorance and vulnerability. Okay, so the dialogues as literature, all right? They also fit a number of the criteria listed in Aristotle's Poetics. The first one, Aristotle says, is that the plot is the most important. And I think in these dialogues that are set right before the fall of Athens, or before, not necessarily right before, the plot is the most important thing. People who are reading these dialogues know that they have the opportunity, they live in some sort of context where there's enough freedom of speech and a capacity to associate with other people, to have conversations about the corruptions of leaders. The whole goal of developing critical thinking in people is a gift. Most people who've ever lived have lived under authoritarian societies that would censor Plato. So Plato is trying to tell you this is what you have to do to preserve the very freedom that has given you the opportunity to read my dialogues. And this is what, if you do this, if you act irrationally, your children will not have that kind of freedom. You'll create instability and social chaos, and then authoritarian leaders will emerge, and people will elect them or want them to take power, and they will censor dialogues like Plato because they don't want people to think critically. So the plot is the most important. It's the imitation of an action, that's true. It's an imitation of a conversation. And then, but the conversation is tied to an action. And there are references in the dialogues about how this character took their mistake in judgment. It was related to their way of life, and it brought them to a bad end. So the action is not as much right in the dialogue, but the reader can identify with the point of view and can realize it leads to a kind of action, and that action leads to disaster. Okay, it's a serious action. That's definitely true. Socrates is always talking about the serious questions. He's a serious person, Aristotle says, a spudaios. And and it matters what people's opinions are about the serious questions because it leads them to act certain ways. Plato's dialogues are extremely well organized. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And they're divided into thirds. And Plato starts out, it's exactly what Aristotle says. He says dialectical inquiry starts with people's opinions. So Socrates always asks his interlocutors. He's a midwife. He starts out with their opinions, and then he tries to examine them and deliver these opinions and look and see if they're really just wind eggs or phantoms, or if they're actually substantial babies that can be raised and nurtured. And always the opinion that human beings are by nature irrational, and that the goals in life are and should be getting as much pleasure, power, sex, money, power, and the fear of death, is not is a wind egg, because you never want other people to have those same goals, because you know it would lead to social chaos, and then you wouldn't have anything. You'd have one person would have all the power over everybody else. So, of course, if you have that opinion, you think you're going to be the guy on top or one of the few on top. But it just doesn't pass the grade in terms of critical examination. So, so the first third is an examination of some interlocutor's opinion, and that leads to a dead end. So Socrates says we have to start all over from a different archai, a different starting point, or different presuppositions, a different view of reality. So then he starts off with the assumption, implicitly or explicitly, that people by nature seek wisdom. And the arguments get different, and the images get different, and the myths get different. So this is what happened in the Phaedrus. Socrates created this myth. Anyway, so the middle section, you're turning around from the cave to the light, and Socrates is guiding the soul. And 2/3 of the way through, the interlocutor, the main issue comes up, and the interlocutor doesn't get it. And so the reader has to get it. The reader should be motivated to get what it is the interlocutor didn't get that led Athens to the fall, partly because this interlocutor did not get it in relationship to this very serious question. So the light bulb didn't go off, the light of the mind didn't go off in those dim bulbs that Socrates is talking to, but the light bulb can go off in the minds of the readers, or those who are talking to each other, having a dialogue about the dialogue. Well, once you've got the light on, then you go back into the cave, and again, the last third assumes people by nature seek money, power, fear of death, status, sex, whatever. And now the educated reader can understand why that is not a good enough opinion, and also why those opinions are self-destructive. They're going to lead to a very bad end. And so the dialogue has this path, and it starts out, the very beginning is the least rational, the farthest removed from reality, and then it moves up and it peaks, and then it moves down. Um, and really, it's amazing how much, to what extent, you can just about count Stephanos' pages, and it's a third and a third and a third. There are exceptions, but it's so amazing how few exceptions there are and how blatant this is. So Plato really is trying, hint, 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 trying to get you to get it. And then it goes farther down and farther down as you go. Okay, the characters are intermediate types, not exceptionally good or evil. Well, yeah, I mean, some people think people like Protagoras, Gorgias, um, are pretty bad, but pretty full of themselves. They might be quite arrogant. But I think Plato wants you to know yourself. He wants you to say, look, if you were that popular, you were that wealthy, you would be tempted to think you knew more than you knew. And so it's much wiser for you to identify with all these characters, to really get inside of their minds, to understand, to empathize. You could be that corrupt. You aren't above such things. So get over a superiority complex of any type. Know your own dark shadow. And then flush it out, right? Learn what that character didn't learn and dedicate yourself to wisdom. Um, the characters have good intentions. So, for example, Thrasymachus in the Republic is totally cynical. He says people people define justice in a way that justifies the power they have, or that justifies them getting into a power struggle and trying to take over power. But mostly it just reinforces the power of the people in power. So he's cynical. So there's no dialogue called Thrasymachus. Um, because he doesn't have good intentions. But the other ones have good intentions. They have some idea of the good, no matter how far it is from what Socrates would consider the truth. They really do think they're good. Meno thinks that he's good because he teaches rhetoric, he teaches persuasion, and he helps people to gain what they want, which is usually power, status, and wealth. That's what everybody wants. What's your problem, Socrates? So, Meno is hardly a serious person, but he's somebody you could empathize with, or you could at least understand. There's a lot of people like this around. One of the main problems, one of the great tragedies of this era was that the average Athenian citizen couldn't tell the difference between Socrates and a sophist. And so Plato has dialogues where Socrates is talking to many different sophists, and also Socrates uses all the same tools that the sophists do. For example, the sophists taught the skill of being able to speak persuasively on both sides of an issue. Well, in the Phaedrus, Socrates does that. He clarifies Lys's speech, and he gives a speech saying you should love the person who doesn't love you, and then he totally rejects it and he gives the opposite speech. So he has an opinion, but he's capable of speaking on both sides of an argument. He uses noble lies, he uses rhetoric, he does what the sophists do, but it's essentially different because he's a dialectician trying to get his interlocutor to love wisdom, whereas the rhetoricians are trying to be successful by helping other people be successful. And basically, they think they have good intentions. They think they're good guys. Okay, the characters are true to type. Their thought and action follows from their character, and that's true. They're all archetypes. They're true to life. There are people like this. Their arguments are also follow archetypes, the inner dialogue of the soul with itself, the dialogue with other people. These are archetypal. They're based on the human condition, and our evolution over many millennia has led to this collective unconscious, so that um, the patterns, the archetypes of people and arguments are intended to trigger that objective psyche and educate people. People can collectively gain wisdom because they can recognize this isn't just about them, it's a pattern that's going to recur with every generation. Um, the characters are closely related. All right, so in Aristotle emphasizes literal biological relationships, but Plato starts because of Athens had developed this democratic or free and open society. The characters relate to each other as fellow citizens because they're responsible to rule and be ruled in turn. And that goes beyond biological association. So he's got this new level of association in the polis, and the characters are related in that way. And so the way they live out their idea of citizenship, their freedom that they're given as citizens, determines whether they actually preserve that freedom or not. And it really matters how they relate to each other and how they talk about the serious questions. That's why the agora and the symposia and all that provided opportunities for citizens to bond together as citizens. Socrates was better than most, okay? So in tragedy, some characters are better than most, some are worse than most, and then the tragic figure is an intermediate. So Socrates says, I'm always governed by my mind, um, and all the way through the dialogues, you're supposed to assume that that is what's driving him. So he's better than the rest of us. Then there are some characters that are worse, the ones that are cynical, um, Alcibiades, Thrasymachus. But then there are the intermediate ones, and those are the average Athenian who sat and listened to this and tragically was not able to distinguish between Socrates and the sophist, and also was not adequately able to understand the point of Athenian society, the cultivation of critical thinking and practical wisdom. So the people who took Socrates to trial were conservatives in the sense that they wanted blind patriotism and literal interpretation of the religious texts, and they accused him of being an atheist. So that was one tragedy. They had the wrong idea of the good, and they ended up killing the guy who was really the best citizen, and who was teaching in a way that was necessary to preserve their free and open society. And then the other intermediate character would be the person that Socrates is talking to. And so we have Laches, Charmides, Phaedrus, Meno, Gorgias, Lysias, Ion, Hippias, Protagoras. All these characters are intermediate types, and they could go either way, just like Phaedrus. He could follow Socrates, turn around from the cave, and love wisdom, or he could stay in the cave with Lysis and love pleasure. There's a reversal of fortune from happiness to misery. Now, this often doesn't happen in the dialogue, but it's going to happen, and the readers need to know that. And recognition is a reversal from ignorance to wisdom. And again, the interlocutors fail, but the reader is supposed to be able to do that. So this is the way Plato modifies the tradition that he grew up with. He wants to educate nous. Nous is inherently active. You can't tell people. Socrates doesn't tell people, doesn't preach things. He doesn't give a doctrine. And Plato even more so. He doesn't do that, but he shows you. He shows you. He gives you every reason to want to learn, and he guides you toward what it is you're supposed to learn, because the dialogues are so organized, you know when the greatest insight is going to come, and you can see that the interlocutor didn't get it, and so you can get. So the reader goes through the reversal and recognition that Athens appears to be a wonderful, flourishing democratic society, but it's not. It's actually a society full of mini tyrants. Everyone has a tyrannical soul. Everybody's out for themselves. Nobody cares about ruling for the well-being of the ruled. Nobody cares about preserving uh, uh, freedom, about being self-critical and self-governing. Not at all. So there's this huge difference between the appearance and the reality of Athens. This reversal that Athens goes through is due to a mistake in judgment. So the interlocutors make a mistake in judgment. They come to a bad end, but that the effect, the consequences aren't shown. But the mistake in judgment is shown, and Socrates examines it, and it is going to be the cause of their downfall. The characters are going to suffer, and that's why readers should want to learn what they didn't learn, so the readers don't suffer. The structure of the events are structured in order to bring about a catharsis, a purgation. First of all, of pity. So Plato wants you to feel sorry for these characters and to identify with them. And then fear. Fear for their own ignorance. So readers should fear for your own ignorance and your capacity to make the same mistake and also to suffer. And then to flush it out, and to have this desire to learn and a desire to seek wisdom. So the ultimate purpose of tragedy and all art is to educate, and it's to educate the mind, the nous. Its desire to know is natural and it's pleasant. The ultimate result of this education is to live an examined life, and this fits with the Delphic oracle. Know thyself, your capacity for evil, and your capacity to love wisdom. Know that the love of wisdom is natural, and evil and overreacting are unnatural and self-destructive, and also nothing in excess, right? Don't overreach. Don't step outside of your natural place in the universe. Okay, Plato's dialogues are poetry, not history. Now, he does take historical characters, as Aristotle says in the Poetics, that the poets usually start with some sort of historical character, but then they exercise poetic license, and they seek the universal, not the particular, because they take an event and a character. The poets find out about some character, some event, and they recognize a pattern. And so then they write it in a way that follows that pattern. They have, Aristotle says, the good poet describes events about what is probable or necessary, what is most likely to happen, what characters necessarily can't do, how they necessarily are limited in certain ways, and whether they're going to try and defy those limits, and they'll get into big trouble. What kind of tragedy also describes what a certain kind of person would likely say or do in a certain kind of situation. This kind of universality is necessary in order for the audience to identify and to learn. An artist who can express the universal has the power to educate. Although you can't make people learn, you definitely can do everything possible to give them a whole lot of reasons to want to learn. Tragedy is not inevitable. People can learn from past mistakes, from history, from art, and not make those mistakes. Um, let's see. People don't have to just they don't have to just learn through their own suffering and experience. They can also learn from other people's suffering and experience so that we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel and making the same mistakes. That's fatalism. Tragedy is very much against fatalism. Even in cases of Oedipus, where Oedipus um, was fated to kill his father and marry his mother, he still needed to know himself. It isn't fatalism. Once he knew himself, he actually gained insight into other people. So, this is a story of every little boy grows up depending on his mother and father, and he tends, most little boys, or oftentimes, they'll fall in love with their mother and compete with their father for their mother's affection. Now, parents can minimize that, but insofar as that, when the young boy comes of age, he shouldn't be, it shouldn't cloud his judgment about how to live his life. I mean, there are little boys whose mothers think their dads don't make enough money, and so in order to one up their dads, they become dedicated to making money. Um, and they can go too far. They can mistreat other people because they're basically obsessed with overpowering their fathers. They have an Oedipus complex. Well, they can, what they need to do is examine it. So, um, the very fact that we're born vulnerable and we get these attachments, they can become complexes, doesn't mean fatalism. It means that we have to be serious about our complexes. We have to recognize them. There's no way we're going to be wise unless we examine them. So it's not fatalism. You're not passive in the face of um, these drives that were started when you were way too young to be conscious. You can bring it to consciousness and then have the power of choice and also be able to exercise that power wisely. But you must examine yourself. Okay, Plato's dialogues are both tragic and beyond tragedy. So in the first part, we're in the cave. Human beings are assumed to be irrational because the opinions of the people Plato's talking to are all based on that. The assumption that the appetitive part of the soul is by far the largest, and political power is exercised to keep those irrational desires under control, and that the purpose of education is to enable students and teachers to gain more power, money, and status. Okay, part two is turning away from the cave toward the light of the mind and toward the power of the good, recognizing the universe is based on the power of mind, and we have this capacity of mind, and that the desire to know is our most powerful desire. It's our most natural way of being. It leads us to flourishing, and it also leads the societies we live in to flourishing, and we depend on other people, and so we can't flourish unless they flourish. All the other appetites sort of fade away, or they're weaker just because people don't give them attention. So people have the power to minimize their appetites just out of lack of interest, not out of constant repression, because the appetites are constantly acting up. So, or they can just pander to their appetites and they get bigger and bigger. So, people decide how to deal with the appetitive part of the soul, but the healthiest part is to just nothing in excess and know thyself as having a mind. Socrates' way of life is the model in Plato's dialogues, and Socrates' way of educating is the model. So Plato's dialogue, Socrates is Plato's idea of the good, of the human good. It's Plato's idea of how someone who is embodying the good lives, in what kind of situations he chooses to get himself into, and how he behaves in those situations. Um, this is where the images of the cave and the divided line come in, and obviously, when Plato talks about the cave in Book 6 of the Republic, he wants you to take that as a pattern and to apply it to all the other dialogues, because all the other dialogues start in the cave, turn toward the light, go back to the cave. And the image of the cave is an image of education, and it has the average person is staring at the shadows on the wall of the cave. And then a teacher comes along who's already been outside of the cave and has seen the light and has seen that there must be a power of good that drives everything and causes it to be ordered and move toward higher levels of complexity. So some people have escaped, gone out of the cave, and then they come back in and they try to lead other people to turn around. They have to turn around. Well, that's exactly what happens in all the dialogues. Socrates is talking to people who live in the cave, and some of them have these caveman opinions, and they're not going to give them up. Their characters are hardened. That's the sophists. But there are some who want to listen, who are capable of learning, and the youth, because they're young, their characters are not formed yet. Socrates will try to teach them. That's why at the beginning of the Republic, he doesn't try to teach people unless they want to know. Because if there's no recognition that you need to know, if they don't desire education, you can't force it on anybody. So Socrates, and he only confronts corrupt people when he's in front of students. He competes with the corrupt sophists, or whatever they are, politicians. He competes against them because he's fighting for the souls of the youth. So when they return to the cave in the last third, now and this is in the image of the cave, it's hard. At first their eyes have to get used to the darkness again, because when they turned toward the light, that was hard. Their eyes had to get used to the light. Then they turn back to the cave, and their eyes have to get used to the darkness. But they can provide guidance for people in the cave who want to turn around and want to get educated. And that's exactly what happens in all the dialogues. Okay, then there's the image of the divided line. And this is important because in Book 5 of the Republic, Socrates says we have to start all over from a different archai, but he talks about what it gets translated sometimes as faculties. See, the trouble is the translators, the same word gets translated differently, which is really a mistake. So sometimes it's faculties, sometimes it's capacities, sometimes I think they use the word powers. I use the word powers, and what I mean is the Greek word dunamai, is a capacity or a power of the soul. And then when that capacity is being exercised, it's an energeia, it's a kind of energy. And this corresponds to Aristotle. He says the virtues are powers of soul, and the vices are too. They're capacities that we have because of the kind of creature we are in the kind of universe we live in. We have the capacity to be greedy or the capacity to be moderate. So we have those powers of soul. And then when we live out our lives a certain way, then those capacities become energia, a kind of energy or activity. Um, so, in the divided line is about the powers of the human soul, and they're about the powers of knowledge, and the powers of wisdom, and the powers of sensation, and the powers of imagination, and the powers of opinion versus the powers of knowledge, the powers of the sensible as opposed to the powers of the intelligible. So, so what happens is every dialogue, there are characters exercising all of those powers simultaneously. And so what happens is um, the dialogues are always set in some very specific, empirical, sensual setting. So the dialogue tries to stimulate the sense of visual image in your imagination. Um, it's kind of vivid oftentimes. The Phaedrus is particularly that way because it's about emotion and the relation between nature and culture. But there's always this attempt to activate the sensation and also to locate an occasion in a historical setting so that you know that this is really about people. This can really happen, even though it's written as a sort of type. So, the world of facts. Then, the characters are engaged in some sort of conversation, and they're using dianoia, some kind of thought. And sometimes it's the power of rhetoric, sometimes the power of logic, sometimes the power, well, it's always some kind of reasoning. Um, okay, let's see. Mathematics, there's the power of studying harmonics, studying the various things you study, but also the power of love, the power of but mostly it's reasoning, arguments, definitions, using those Apollonian tools, scientific evidence gathering, the calculation of means to ends. And the tragedies in Homer had people exercising all of those powers. And then in the Greek Paideia documents, that some characters are exercising those powers. They all have an idea of the good, and they're employing their intellectual faculties to promote their idea of the good. But some of them are wrong. They have a mistake in judgment about the good, and that's what happens in Plato's dialogues. And there's two fundamentally different ways to conceive of the good: the high road and the low road. And one of them is Socrates. He's using the power of his nous, and everything he does, his dianoia is tied to nous and the love of wisdom. So his personal life, his physical life, his mental life are all integrated into the mind, into wisdom, and he's always, he has noetic insight at every point. Now, the sophists are the ones who live at the level of akasia, because akasia, the level of imagination, which is 3 removes from reality, is, Socrates uses the example of holding up a mirror to the world, and the mirror is a reflection of the physical world. Well, the sophists do that intellectually. They look around, they say, well, it sure appears like all people care about is sex, money, power, and the fear of death, status, all these things that are tangible or that you get tangible rewards for. And so the sophist holds up a mirror, and then he dedicates all of his dianoetic powers to promoting his own pleasure, power, status, and also to giving other people the skills to also get rich or powerful or famous. So the sophists, the sophist is at the level of acacia, and then the youth are in between. They're at the level of pistis, and they're listening to these two people battling it out. And Socrates is at the level of noesis, using dianoia to try and turn the interlocutors in that direction. And the sophists are at the level of acacia, one level below facts, and they're using the powers of dianoia to try and turn those young people or those Athenian citizens in the direction of how to live, what it is to be successful, on the assumption that all people care about is sex, money, power, status, and avoiding death, things like that. So the powers of the soul in the divided line are played out in every single dialogue. Now, there's a couple exceptions, and I'm going to read a paper on the ion in another video or two, so I have to, I know that not every dialogue has a student and a good guy and the bad guy and the struggle between good and evil, because in the ion there are no interlocutors. Nobody's listening. It's just Ion and Socrates. And the reason for that is because Ion is a performer, and if anybody had been there, he would not have told Socrates his real idea, which is, when I'm reciting my tragedies and people are laughing, I'm crying because I'm not going to get any money that day. But when I'm reciting tragedies and people are crying, I'm laughing because I know I'm really going to cash in. He would never say that if there was anybody standing around. He would lose his reputation, and he's very aware of his audience. So that's why there's no third person in that particular dialogue. Okay, there's also the theme of the two roads, the high road and the low road. And that is explicit also in the very beginning of the Republic. Socrates comes to Cephalus' house, and he says to him, Cephalus is old now, and he says, okay, you've been on the road of life. Why don't you tell me about it? And Cephalus assumes that life is about sex, money, power, and the fear of death. And he just assumes it, and he talks about what it's like to be old, and he actually thinks of himself as a pretty mellow old guy, a lot nicer than his old geezer friends who still want to have sex and drink and regret the fact they can't do it anymore. Cephalus is much more mature. He's glad to be rid of that wild beast and and to just kind of hang out and actually go pray to the gods, because he's feeling he's having second thoughts about his youth, and he's trying to buy out the gods, pay some of his money to the gods and the temples so that he can make it to the right place in Hades. Anyways, Cephalus is definitely on the low road, and Socrates, of course, wouldn't agree with any of that. And Glaucon and Adimantus at the beginning of Book 2 recognize that, right? That they've just been discussing, Book 1 is all about the low road. And so they tell Socrates, look, our authority figures are always telling us we should be successful according to worldly standards. But we know that you are different. So we want you to try and convince us that we should love wisdom. So anyway, this is a pattern that's explicit in the Republic, that's implicit in the other dialogue. So what happens is that there's equivocation on terms. All of the terms that get called forms have two different manifestations in the powers of the soul of the characters. So Protagoras has the temperance of a sophist, of a caveman, somebody that assumes people are by nature irrational will be temperate in the way that Protagoras is. Socrates has the temperance, has philosophical temperance. Um, Same with courage, the same with two different kinds of doctors practicing medicine, the same with beauty, physical beauty versus spiritual beauty and the beauty of the universe, the same with two kinds of power, the power of wisdom versus political power or money. So, all the way through the dialogues, you have this equivocation on a term. And so people have two different, fundamentally different ideas of the good, of what is advantageous, of how to calculate the most efficient means to their ends, because they have fundamentally different ends. Um, so, um, so there is a metaphysical irony. Plato wants you to go through this reversal and recognition process. You start out in the world of appearances, and the dialogue tries to get you to flip around to a world of reality. This is a psychological world. It's the powers of the human soul. You awaken your love of wisdom, which then will be fit with rational courage, rational temperance, rational rhetoric, and every other power of the soul. So the dialogue appears to be the opposite of what really is. It appears that Athens is a flourishing city. It's not. These people appear to be just and wise, and other people believe they are, and they're not. And gradually that becomes clear. Readers then have to reject the world of appearances and turn psychologically, have a conversion experience. To convert means to turn around to a world of reality beyond, behind what the dialogue actually says, but it is in Socrates' mind. So you don't have to physically go anywhere else, but you have to mentally completely turn around. Readers have to engage in their own reversal and recognition of the underlying truth. The interlocutors are defending and living out irrational versions of courage, temperance, justice, etc. And Socrates is defending and living out the philosophical version of courage, temperance, justice, and friendship and dialogue and all those other things that the dialogues speak about. So those are the main patterns that I looked for and I argued for in the dialogues. And I'll talk about more dialogues to show you, but I'm not going to do all of them, but again, this is a pattern. I would love for other people to pick up and try this kind of analysis on another one of Plato's dialogues. Now, one more thing. Oh, okay, that's it.